Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is a great personality who lived a short and valuable life. A special education that has placed great creativity in 32 years, who was introduced to music at the age of 3. It is impossible not to be amazed when studying his life. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born on January 27, 1756 in the city of the same name in the Archbishopric of Salzburg, Austria, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire, in the family of Leopold and Anna Maria Pertl Mozart. He also had a sister named Nannerl Maria Anna. Mozart was baptized the day after his birth in the Church of St. Rupert. Mozart's father, Leopold Mozart, was the deputy Kapellmeister of the Salzburg Archbishopric and composer, as well as an experienced teacher. When his daughter Nannerl was 7 years old, Leopold began to give her keyboard lessons. 3-year-old Wolfgang would admire this musical instrument. His sister later said, "When he was 4 years old, our father taught him to play a piece or two on the keyboard for his amusement. The child soon played these pieces flawlessly and with great grace. At 5, he began to compose small pieces himself, and our father, in amazement, wrote them down. Among these early works were the Andante K1A and the Allegro in C K1B. Despite the fact that Mozart's biographer Maynard Solomon taught Leopold's children with all his heart, little Wolfgang decided to go beyond what his father had taught him. His father could not hold back his tears, delighted by his child's incredible innate talent and the wonders he had created. As a result, in the face of his child's divine talent, his father gave up composing and devoted himself to teaching his children languages and other subjects. During Mozart's childhood, the family made several trips throughout Europe, and Leopold Mozart demonstrated his children's talents on these trips. The first such performance took place in Munich at the Bavarian Electoral Palace. The next such concert was held in the same year at the Vienna Royal Palace and in Prague. The long concert tours lasted exactly 3.5 years and took the family to Munich, Mannheim, Paris, London, The Hague, and again to the Paris Royal Palaces. On their return to Vienna, the Mozart family also visited Zurich and Donaueschingen. During these trips, Mozart met many musicians and became acquainted with their works. One of these memorable meetings was a meeting with Johann Sebastian Bach while in London. The Mozart family returned to Vienna at the end of 1767 and stayed there until December 1768. During this trip, Mozart contracted smallpox, but his father strongly objected to his son being vaccinated, considering it God's will. After a year in Salzburg, they made 3 trips to Italy in the following years. However, this time only Mozart and his father went on the trip. These trips lasted from December 1769 to March 1771, from August to December 1771, and from October to March 1773. The first trip to Italy is reminiscent of the early trips. The purpose of these trips was to demonstrate the abilities and talents of Mozart, who had already entered his teenage years, as a performer and a rapidly developing composer. Mozart met C.B. Martini in Bologna and was accepted as a member of the famous Accademia Filarmonica. In Rome, he saw Gregorio Allegri's Miserere in the Sistine Chapel and memorized it, later transferring it to paper. With this, Mozart made the first illegal copy of the work that the Vatican most strictly protected. In Milan, Mozart successfully performed the opera Mithridate Re di Ponto. After this opera, Mozart received orders to write operas. Leopold and Wolfgang returned to Milan from Salzburg twice to compose and premiere the operas Ascanio in Alba and Lucio Silla. At the end of his last visit to Italy, Mozart wrote the solo cantatum Exultate Jubilati, K165. After his last visit to Italy, Mozart was employed as a court musician to the Salzburg ruler, Prince Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo. Mozart gained many friends and admirers in Salzburg. He wrote symphonies, sonatas, string quartets, serenades, and occasional operas in many genres. For example, between April and December 1775, Mozart had the desire to write a violin concerto, and he composed 5 such concertos, each more perfect than the previous one. The last 3, K216, K218, and K219, are considered staples of the repertoire. The E-flat piano concerto, K. 271, is initially considered a discovery of classical music with an unexpected break in the orchestra by the soloist. However, Mozart gradually decided to leave Salzburg and look for work elsewhere. The reason for this is the low salary of 150 florins that he earned. In addition, Mozart loved to write operas, and Salzburg provided rare opportunities for this at best. The situation was further aggravated by the closure of the Palace Theatre in 1775. The other theaters in the city were too small to accommodate traveling troops. 2 long-term travel searches interrupted their long stay in Salzburg. Wolfgang and Leopold visited Vienna from July 14 to September 12, 1773, and Munich from December 6, 1774 to March 1775. Although both trips were unsuccessful, Mozart premiered his opera La Finta Giardiniera in Munich with great success. On September 23, 1777, Mozart went on another tour, this time accompanied by his mother. This time the tour included Munich, Mannheim, and Paris. In Mannheim, Mozart met members of the Mannheim Orchestra, which was considered the best orchestra in Europe at the time. He also fell in love with Aloysia Weber, the daughter of one of the city's musical families. From there, Mozart went to Paris, where he continued his search for work. However, the trip to Paris was unsuccessful. However, he was offered a job as an organist at Versailles, but he refused because he did not like the job. Another unpleasant consequence of his trip to Paris was the illness and death of his mother. Returning to Salzburg, Mozart settled in Munich again and met Aloysia, who had already become a performer on the opera stage. However, this time the girl showed no interest in Mozart. Mozart's discontented days in Salzburg continued after his trips. The question arises as to why Mozart, despite all his talents, could not find work during his trips. According to Maynard Solomon, the problem was that Mozart could not agree on a job with his father. His father insisted that Mozart receive a salary that would support the whole family, while Mozart thought of working as a freelance musician in one of the big cities and maintaining friendships with aristocratic families as long as was necessary for an important job. In January 1781, Mozart's opera Idomeneo was staged in Munich with great success. In March of the same year, the composer was invited to Vienna. Meanwhile, the Prince of Salzburg, whose court Mozart had once worked for, was attending the coronation of Emperor Joseph II. In the face of his success in Munich, he was troubled by the Archbishop's treatment of him as a servant, especially when Countess Thun forbade him from performing in front of the emperor, who was his guest. In May, the dispute intensified. Mozart tried to resign, but was refused. However, the following month, he was finally dismissed. However, this happened in a rather unpleasant way. Mozart was dismissed from the palace in a humiliating manner, organized by the Archbishop's butler, Count Arco. Meanwhile, Mozart was considering going to Vienna and earning a good salary there. The most painful aspect of the dispute with the Archbishop for him was his father's support for the Archbishop. His father insisted that Mozart return to his previous position and reconcile with the Archbishop at all costs. Wolfgang, however, insisted on his views with the same stubbornness and declared that he would continue his future alone in Vienna. The dispute ended with Mozart escaping from the clutches of the venerable Archbishop and refusing his father's demands to return. Mozart's biographer Solomon characterized this as a revolutionary step and wrote that this step would have a great influence on his future life. Mozart's arrival in Vienna was very successful. He first performed as a pianist and competed with Muzio Clementi in a piano competition held at the Imperial Palace on December 24, 1781, and soon proved himself to be a skilled pianist. Mozart also achieved great success as a composer. Between 1781 and 1782, he wrote the opera Die Entführung aus dem Serail. This work was staged on July 16, 1782, and brought great success to the author. The work was soon performed in German-speaking parts of Europe, further increasing Mozart's reputation as a composer. Mozart lived with the Weber family, who had moved from Mannheim to Vienna. The head of the family, Friedhelm Weber, had died, and the Weber family made a living by renting out their house. Aloysia, who had rejected Mozart's love, had married an actor named Joseph Lang. This time Mozart began to take an interest in the Weber family's third daughter, Constance. The couple married on August 4, 1782, with the reluctant consent of her father Leopold. Constance gave birth to 6 children by Mozart. Only 2 of the babies survived, Carl Thomas and Franz Xavier Wolfgang. The latter became a composer himself. In 1782 to 1783, Mozart became closely acquainted with the works of Bach and Handel at the insistence of Baron Gottfried van Swieten, who owned most of the manuscripts of works by Baroque musicians. Mozart's study of these composers influenced his early imitation of the Baroque genre and later the discovery of his own personal style, as exemplified by the fugal passages in the Magic Flute and at the end of his 41st Symphony. In 1783, Wolfgang and Constance visited the Mozart family in Salzburg. However, the trip was unsuccessful. Leopold and Handel were at best gentle with Constance. However, the trip to Salzburg is remembered for the composition of one of Mozart's most beautiful liturgical pieces, the Mass in C minor. Although the work was never completed, it was staged in Salzburg and Constance performed at its premiere. Some time after returning to Vienna, Mozart met Haydn, and the 2 great composers soon became friends. When Haydn visited Vienna, he met Mozart, and they played together in a quartet. Mozart dedicated 6 quartets to Haydn: K387, K421, K428, K458, K464, and K465, and is said to have been written in response to Haydn's Opus 33 in 1781. After listening to the last 3 of these quartets for the first time, Haydn said to Mozart's father, "I tell you with all my sincerity before God that your son is the most talented composer I have ever seen or heard of. He has a musical sense, and moreover, no one else knows the subtleties of composition as well as he does." Between 1782 and 1785, Mozart wrote a series of piano concertos in which he himself performed as a soloist. He wrote 3 or 4 concertos for each concert season. Due to the limited space in the city theater, he booked the living room and restaurant of his apartment building, which were not intended for concerts, but were large enough as meeting places. At that time, concerts were very fashionable in Vienna, and Mozart's music for such concerts can be considered his best works. Solomon Mozart's transition to a major musical genre, creating a harmonious connection between the passionate composer-performer and the delighted audience, ensured its perfection. With the large sums of money he earned from his concerts, Mozart and Constanze lived a luxurious life. They moved into an apartment with a rent of 460 florins. Mozart also bought a beautiful piano from a man named Anton Walter for 900 florins and a billiard table for 300 florins. Mozart also sent his son Carl Thomas to an expensive boarding school and began to keep servants in the house. Thus, the young family spent excessively, and in part because of this, they were unable to withstand the difficult financial problems that the young Mozart family would face in the following years. On December 14, 1784, Mozart became a Freemason and was admitted to the lodge Zur Wohltätigkeit. Freemasonry played a significant role in Mozart's life for the rest of his life. He attended many meetings of the society, made many Masonic friends, and on some occasions composed Masonic music. Despite the success of Die Entführung aus dem Serail, Mozart rarely turned to this genre in the following years, apart from 2 incomplete and 1-act operas, Der Schauspieldirektor. Instead, he focused more on composing piano concertos and concertos. However, towards the end of 1785, he took a break from piano concertos and began his operatic career with a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. In 1786, the opera The Marriage of Figaro was successfully staged in Vienna. The work was also a great success in Prague. The success of the work in Prague led to a commission from da Ponte, which resulted in the opera Don Giovanni. Prague opera lovers greatly appreciated the work's premiere in 1787, and the work was successfully performed in Vienna a year later. Both operas are considered to be Mozart's most important works and form the basis of the operatic repertoire of our time. The musical complexity of these operas caused difficulties for both audiences and performers at their premieres. In December 1787, Mozart received permanent employment under the patronage of a nobleman. Emperor Joseph II appointed Mozart as his chamber composer after the death of the court chamber composer Gach. However, this was not a full-time job. Although Mozart received a salary of only 800 florins a year, this required him to compose dances for the annual balls held at the Red Utensil. Mozart complained to Constance that his salary was too much for what he did, but too little for what he could do. This would confirm the extent to which this meager source of income would be necessary for the young family in the following years. The palace archives show that the emperor's real intention was simply to prevent Mozart from leaving Vienna to seek work elsewhere. Meanwhile, to be more precise, in 1787 Ludwig van Beethoven came to Vienna for 2 weeks with the desire to meet Mozart. The evidence about what happened at this meeting is highly controversial, and at least 3 hypotheses are cited. Mozart listened to Beethoven and praised him. Mozart rejected Beethoven as a student. Or, finally, they never met. Mozart fell ill during the September 6 premiere of La Clemenza di Tito, which was performed at the emperor's coronation in Prague in 1791. He was able to perform for a while. Mozart conducted the premiere of the Magic Flute on September 30th. However, his illness began to worsen from November 20th. He was already bedridden, suffering from fever, pain, and intense vomiting. Mozart was cared for by his wife, Constance, his younger sister Sophie, and the family physician Thomas Franz Close. There is evidence that he attempted to complete the Requiem in such a severe state of illness. However, the talk that he dictated it to Sussmayer is not plausible. Mozart died at 1 a.m. on December 5th. His funeral is described as follows. Mozart was buried on December 7th in an ordinary grave in the St. Mark's Cemetery on the outskirts of the city, in accordance with the customs prevailing in Vienna at that time. Later, the idea that no one attended his funeral is consistent with the customs of funerals in Vienna at that time. Later, Jan wrote that Salieri, Sussmayer, Van Swieten, and 2 other musicians also attended the funeral. The idea that the funeral was held in a snowstorm is incorrect. The day was calm and mild. It has not been possible to determine the cause of Mozart's death with certainty. The official documents about his death describe the symptoms of the disease as Hitziges Frieselfieber, which means acute miliary fever, referring to a rash the color of millet grains. However, this description is not enough to determine the cause of the disease. Dozens of hypotheses have been put forward as the cause: trichinellosis, flu, poisoning, and a rare kidney disease. The treatment method, which was common in medicine at the time, such as bleeding patients in large quantities, is also considered a possible cause of death. However, the most widely accepted version is that Mozart died of acute rheumatism. As a child, Mozart suffered from rheumatic pains 3 or 4 times. It is also known that rheumatism recurs periodically, and each attack is followed by serious complications, such as severe infection and damage to the heart valves. Mozart's quiet funeral does not at all reflect his position in society as a composer. After his death, concerts dedicated to his memory in Vienna and Prague attracted even larger crowds. Indeed, after his death, the composer's fame grew in an unprecedented way. Solomon writes that during this period there was an unprecedented enthusiasm for Mozart's works. Biographies of the composer were published, and authors competed to complete his unfinished works. The last year of his life is remembered for its great productivity and personal revival. During this year, Mozart created a large number of musical works: the Magic Flute, the Last Piano Concerto K. 595 in B-flat, the Clarinet Concerto K. 622, the Last String Quartet in E-flat, K. 614, the Church Hymn Ave Verum Corpus K. 618, and the Requiem K. 626, which he could not finish. This great personality became closely acquainted with the music of these countries during his visits to Italy, France, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In general, he liked the songs of other peoples. Mozart's musical journeys were a serious and important school for him. He later wrote, "No one has devoted as much effort to the study of the laws of musical composition as I have. I have studied the musical works of all famous composers with great effort and attention.